I want to introduce our lunchtime speaker. You've got General Jim Mattis's bio in front of you. He's currently serving as Commander of Joint Forces Command, the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. And I won't go into his bio. We should note that he succeeded in his Marine career despite being taught at some point along the way by Mac Owens. So this is a testament to his ability to work through Mac's torture. And just a couple of personal reflections on General Mattis' career, his impact. He, of course, is known in large measure for what he's accomplished on the battlefield over the past couple of years, but he is a thinking Marine of the highest order. And along with Dave Petraeus, was the flag officer that animated not only the formation of the counterinsurgency manual, but also the formation of the doctrine and our refocus on it in many ways. And when Dave pushed me when I was in office to start the counterinsurgency doctrine for the civilian side of government, one of the first things I did is I headed down to Quantico to link up with General Mattis and his group and seek his own counsel and the counsel of his group for how you get this thing done. So a first-class thinker in this regard. His battlefield exploits are legend and going to get more legendary as he will be portrayed in a film. There's no truth to the rumor that he'll be portrayed by Mickey Rourke. It's actually going to be Harrison Ford, I'm told. So that should be an interesting episode. And the last thing I would just note, and I think a reflection that many of us have, but when historians look back on the period of time and these wars we're fighting, I think they will largely and accurately describe them as wars of captains and lieutenants and sergeants and corporals. They will write about two generals. They will write about General Dave Petraeus, and they will write about our next speaker, General Jim Mattis. And that will be well-deserved accolades for two generals that have shaped the thinking and the conduct of counterinsurgency in this period. So without further ado, General.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for having me here. First, it's always good to have to come and do one of these because it causes you to stop and actually think for a few minutes, and that's an unusual thing that we do nowadays at this rank. And it's a real honor to come and speak to you. After some of my publicized remarks, it's an honor to be invited anywhere in polite company to speak anymore. So we'll see if I get invited back here. But based on what I heard for the last 10 minutes before I walked in the room, I just completely dumped my speech. I'm going to go with a slightly different tack because I want to make certain we have time for questions and answers, which is always the best part of an event like this. But let me just talk for a few minutes. As you know from the introduction, I have two jobs. I'm the Supreme Commander for Allied Command Transformation, which means I facilitate transformation, that sort of thing, in NATO, and I can get into some details there. And in Joint Forces Command, we have basically about 1.3 million troops under us, and aircraft carriers and airplane squadrons and Army brigades and Marine air-ground task forces. And when General Petraeus or Admiral Keating need forces, they come in and we assign those forces out. That part of Joint Force Command takes very little time. It's very straightforward, and we also train the Joint Forces headquarters that go in to Baghdad, to Bagram, to Hoa, there in Djibouti. We do that sort of thing. But the bottom line is I spend most of my time on forward-looking concepts. That's the intellectual demanding part. That's where the two jobs, NATO and Joint Forces Command, come together. And the picture up here, this is the sum total of my PowerPoint slides. This is Janus, Roman god. He's looking forward and backward. It's not two-faced hypocritical as we define it today. It's two-faced. You're looking at what's going on in the past. You're looking forward. And really the history that we have provides us some of our very best signposts for the future, especially if some of that history is very, very recent. And here's the bottom line. I got the phone call that I was going to the Allied Command Transformation and I was going to U.S. Joint Forces Command when I was in Kabul, Afghanistan. So I called for a map of NATO. They didn't have one there. And so they got me a map of the world, and I looked at it, and here I was, a Marine from California who answered to Admiral, at that point, General Abizaid and Admiral Fallon as the Marine Forces Central Command. And I looked at that, and there I was in Kabul, closer to Brussels than Brussels is to my headquarters in Norfolk. And therein lies part of the problem. because here's where we stand right now. We are superior to enemies in terms of nuclear warfare right now. We've lost a little bit of it. We'll get it back very, very quickly. Sleep well at night. The problem's solved. We are superior in conventional warfare. We've lost some of our edge. When we get the dwell time back to the Chief of Staff of the Army and to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, we will very rapidly recover our edge there. And we are not superior in irregular warfare, and that's what we've got to do. And the reason I bring this up is, as I studied from Kabul on, trying to figure out what I have to do to help transform, I went back through history and found how do armies transform, how have militaries transformed throughout history. And every one of them, from Alexander the Great at Persepolis in what we now call Iran, when he took his perfect warfighting machine, successful in all venues against enemies with better technology, outnumbered him in sieges in open warfare, and he reorganized it to the Germans, World War I, to the U.S. Navy in the interwar years. Every military in history, I can go on for hours, that transformed, that changed, that modernized, did so on the basis of one thing. They identified a problem and solved it. They didn't assign the supreme commander for transformation, say, there, we solved the problem. They didn't come up with some wrong-headed bumper sticker about revolution in military affairs and decide that was going to change the fundamental nature of war. The fundamental nature of war will change about the same time the fundamental chemical composition of water changes, okay? War is war, unpredictable, bizarre at times, muddling. We muddle our ways in. If I was to sum up everything I've learned in 35 years of wearing this uniform, it could be summed up in 3 words when you go into a fight. Improvise, improvise, improvise. And the more we anticipate, the more we try to get it right ahead of time, the less you have to improvise in combat. You will always have to improvise. But how do we get it right? The way the U.S. military addressed this was we took the Joint Operating Environment, the JOE we call it for short, we always have an acronym, and we wrote what we think the problem is. Remember, we have to identify the problem. We laid out what the operating environment looks like that the joint force will operate in the future. And in doing this, we try to take the big trends in demography and in demographics and climate change, all these kind of things, and turn to what are the military implications and lay out the problem in the JOE. Then the chairman assigned to us to do the capstone concept for joint operations. There, we wrote down how the joint force will operate, and really for the first time, thanks to the clarity of the kind of battles we've been fighting, the different things happening in the world, first time since Colin Powell, the chairman, put his thumbprint squarely on how the joint force is going to operate. And so we have a problem statement and we have a solution, and now we take that solution and we test it. We experiment with it, we shoot holes in it, that sort of thing. We had all sorts of people help us. Some of them are sitting here in this room looking at me right now, and I appreciate it. We had people in our advisory group from the Hill. We had Senator Clinton. We had former Speaker Gingrich. We had the former sound mixer for the Frank Zappa band. We tried to bring in some really strange people to break us out of our regimented approach to problem solving and problem definition, problem setting. Because if we don't set the problem right, we are probably going to get it wrong. I don't care how short you Marines cut your hair or how fast you run 3 miles. If we get the concepts wrong, as the Israelis saw in Second Lebanon War, your boys, no matter how brave, are going to catch RPGs in the chest, and you're not going to accomplish your objectives. So when you get concepts incorrectly done, then you really pay a price. Our job is not to get it 100% correct. You will never get it 100% correct. We just don't want to get it completely wrong. And that's where we were off on the effort over the last few months to get this thing, I think, about right. We are absolutely certain that we will fight in the future. I was asked to talk about 21st century warfare. We will fight in coalitions, first, last, and always. We will be fighting against enemies in hybrid conditions. War is war. I accept that. And some people have asked me, challenged me, why do you use irregular war as a term? The reason we do it, ladies and gentlemen, is if we don't set up some kind of tension, some kind of magnet to pull the department out of its good old mano a mano conventional war, if we don't do that, then we won't shift the budgeting, we won't shift the focus over to where it has to go. Really, we're going to have to be able to fight hybrid enemies, and that could be something like Second Lebanon that we're looking at very closely, where a high-tech cruise missile takes out a ship, where an enemy hiding amongst the people sets off IEDs, where they're using cyber, they have good information operations campaign, they've learned how to influence the international media, all the things that you all have been hearing about, studying. I realize I'm talking to people who actually look at this. But the bottom line is we do not want the U.S. forces to be dominant and irrelevant in the future, and we can do that. That is what we must avoid by getting the problem right and the solution right. You take on the U.S. Air Force or the Naval Aviation, Marine Aviation at 15,000 feet in a fighter, NATO Air Forces, you only have one role, fugitive. You better fly away real fast or you're going to get shot out of the air. You take on a U.S. Navy on the high seas, they'll burn you to the waterline. That's all there is to it. You take on a U.S. Army in the open desert, in open terrain and mechanized warfare, the Army will annihilate you. That, taking on whatever the Air Forces leave untouched, which won't be much. But the area that we are not superior in is irregular warfare. And we are going to make irregular warfare, per Secretary Gates' speech about balance, we are going to make it a core competency of the U.S. military. We're not going to hold our breath. We're not going to say it's going to go away. That's not going to happen. And we're going to figure this thing out and decide who does what in this effort. It doesn't mean that every service is 50-50 conventional and irregular. Actually, it means an awful lot of our troops are going to have to fight across that entire spectrum. And if the Roman Empire could have troops that held the boundaries, the borders, and still disciplined inside against guerrillas and uprisings, if the British troops could do it, if they could hold the subcontinent, I believe it was with 22,000 British regulars on the Indian subcontinent by bringing on board the Indian Army, the British Indian Army, surely there's a way for us to figure out how to do this thing right with a mix of soft and hard power. So the bottom line is we've identified what we think is the fundamental problem, and that is gaining competency at the national level and right down to the tactical level under the strategic to tactical compression in irregular warfare without surrendering our nuclear superiority and our conventional superiority behind which the international community gains great benefit. Now, we've got some paradigms being broken. You have to wonder, if we were here a year ago, I would tell you the chances of borders being changed by force in Europe pretty much gone, right? We resolved that, said it's over with. Well, borders were changed in Europe. If you consider Georgia part of Europe, kind of a stretch, but I guess it is. Borders have been changed by force, and not much happened, did it? I mean, basically, a lot of newspaper articles written, but not much happened. So what does that tell us about the future? One thing is we surrender our superiority in conventional war at our own peril. You think it's expensive to keep a conventional war force alive. It's a lot more expensive to have to fight a conventional war. So we're not given the freedom with America where it's at this point in its history to say we're going to surrender some part of the spectrum. The paradox of war is the enemy will always move against your perceived weakness. So either we maintain conventional war superiority with very well-trained and educated leaders, and that includes enlisted leaders who can fight across the spectrum and adapt to the kind of surprises that we know are coming. Again, we know surprises are coming. Or we're going to end up creating the very thing we don't want, which is a conventional war. So that's where we're going. And I thought I would stop there. I've got some more notes. I can keep right on going, but let me stop there and let's see who's got the first challenge for me.
And if I could just remind you, since it's being webcast, if you could use one of the two microphones.
General Chris Seipel, I'm with a group that looks at religion and security. Two questions for you. What are we doing to prepare our troops, men and women, for cultural engagement, and in particular religion, and especially Islam? That's the common element, like the weather, that affects all that we do from Israel all the way through Iran, India. Second, with your NATO hat, the supply lines into Afghanistan aren't so good now. Looks like Uzbekistan could come back into the picture. What are your thoughts on Termez becoming a land bridge again, and maybe using Termez as a cultural engagement training center for NATO troops going to do PRTs?
Yeah, I'd rather not address that second one because I don't consider myself an operational commander, and there's too many people running around speaking authoritatively about things they don't know. If I know something about that because I've served over there, as you know, for a bit. But I'd rather leave that to someone I think would be more appropriate, if you don't mind. I mean, obviously, we can resupply ourselves in Afghanistan. It takes strong diplomatic efforts. We need alternate routes. I have no problem with the one you're proposing, but I would defer that to General Petraeus and our State Department and the people who work those alongside the NATO headquarters. But your first one, I think, goes to the heart of what we have to change in our military. We do not live in an age where you can say we're going to send troops into a theater and expect them to have a positive impact unless they are historically and culturally, linguistically, religious-wise, they understand where they're going. The Japanese Army has a saying that if you send an untrained troop into battle, he's a bigger threat to his comrades and to his own mission than he is to the enemy. In our industrial way of forming armed forces at times and our desire to use whatever weapon system we have, we sometimes forget that war is a human problem that demands human solutions. We, as a British Prime Minister put it once the Americans have exhausted all the possible alternatives, they'll do the right thing. From the coin doctrine and from the training we've shifted to, from the cultural training, I think we have really broken the code on this. Now the challenge is more along the language lines. We can get it right as far as the cultural training, religious preparation of our troops so they know what they're getting into. But I think we need to have a degree of honesty about all this. And we need to make sure that we don't create an enemy that's more monolithic and has more support than he really has. There was no surprise to any of us that Al-Anbar province in Iraq turned against the enemy. In 2004, we knew we were going to turn them. Now, you think of all the news articles that have been printed since 2004, but we knew we were going to take a largely Christian, all-American force out in that western Iraq in the Sunni Triangle, and we knew that combination didn't go over well, but we knew we could turn them. So I think it's just as important as you talk about how we prepare them for the religious aspect, that we make certain we don't overemphasize it. Those folks turned, and you could say, well, why would they turn against their own religion? It has nothing to do with religion. This is a fight against tyranny. These people really believe when they get in charge, women have no human rights, they're beasts. They don't go to school. This isn't propaganda. I mean, I've talked to enough of them we captured. In Kandahar, Afghanistan, when we first went in there, not one girl had been to school for 5 years. It's more important that they understand this aspect of the tyranny we're up against, and whether you call it Islamic fanaticism or, I mean, these people have killed more Muslims than they've killed Jews or Christians, and it's something to remember. So we just got to be careful how we do this, and we don't make it too broad a brush. And I think we're doing it about right now, but we've got a ways to go. Those of you who've been around a while remember Soviet military power. Every year we'd put out a big shiny book, and every one of us knew what a motorized rifle division was made up of. Every one of us knew what range on a flanker aircraft. We knew this stuff. How many of us today know to the point they could answer your question? We're not there yet, but we're on the right trajectory. Thank you.
Sir, based on your comments of maintaining a conventional force is more expensive or less expensive than fighting a conventional force in regards to the Georgia campaign with Russia and our consideration of Russian reemergence and possible confrontations with upcoming elections in the Ukraine, do you see that was a choice that we didn't fight or determined to fight because it wasn't worth cost isn't worth the gain, i.e. in the Georgia campaign and in the case of Ukraine coming to the forefront? Is it just a choice that we make not to do it, not that we don't have the capability? Oh,
I mean, certainly we had the capability. We're talking about political will here and calculations of what's in our interest, NATO's interest. President Sarkozy, this last weekend, I was in Munich for the security conference. President Sarkozy, in his energetic and animated way, brought up a fundamental question there. He said, does Europe want to be left alone, or does Europe want to defend its values? Does it want peace, or does it want to be left in peace? A very interesting question. I think that in this case, Georgia was not part of NATO, and it's a legitimate question about whether or not NATO should have done anything about this beyond what it did. I leave that to policymakers. I wear a uniform. But that said, you know, we're going to have to come to grips with this sort of thing in a manner that allows us to give clearer guidance in the future so that people don't push us too far. My read of history is you stumble into wars, you muddle into wars, other things happen and drag you into wars. I don't think that's changed one bit. So actually I'm going to Georgia here in about 2 weeks and spend a couple days there with them. I could probably answer your question better after looking at what actually happened there. But it doesn't change the fundamental idea that your values and your interests, if your values are part of your interests, if you really believe your values, your principles are worth fighting for, you've got to make very clear what they are so you avoid that sort of misunderstanding.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Probably not the best answer, but it's the best one I can give you right now. I think President Sarkozy, his question is the best answer.
Yes, sir.
We're going to take a online question from one of our online participants and then come right back over here. Go ahead, Alan.
We have a question from General Mick Traynor. Could you say a bit about your views on effects-based operations?
Thanks a lot, General. Ladies and gentlemen, we're all subject to our own experiences. I've been called an infantry officer, which would surprise the Marines, because even in infantry battalions, of course, you have F-18 pilots in your infantry battalion from the time you're a second lieutenant tapping you on the shoulder saying there's a different way to solve this problem. Watch this. Here's where I'm coming from. A couple of points up front. The U.S. Air Force came up with a sound approach to taking out closed, complex systems. If it's a highway grid, a railroad grid, electrical grid, they came up with a way to do it. And to this day, I think it stands any kind of scrutiny. It is precise, it is pure, and it is good. And then a thing called U.S. Joint Forces Command decided to take that and migrate it from a closed complex system to an open complex system. And if you study quantum physics, you run into a fundamental problem when you do that. Because what you just said was, when you go to an interactive system, that you can predictably say, if I do that, put an algebraic equal sign equals this result. And when you're dealing with human beings, you should be very, very careful about this. For example, I'll bet nobody 3 days into the Kosovo bombing campaign thought, well, one of the effects will be 375,000 refugees on the road. No, that wasn't it. That's the fundamental nature of war is inconsistent with a closed, complex system approach. And this idea of predictability, of deterministic or mechanistic approach to war, this American desire for certainty in war, flies in the face of the fundamental nature of war. And when you go against the nature of something, you're probably going to lose. Remember, don't mess with Mother Nature, okay? I think that that's where I was coming from on it. I still salute the Air Force's rigorous way of approaching closed, complex targeting. But war is not a matter of servicing targets. We cannot figure out how somebody is going to respond that well, that reliably, and you're always going to get surprised. So what I wanted, as many of you know who have read the note I sent to my command, the Israeli officers have been very blunt. There's ladies present. I won't use the obscenities they use to describe it, but they do not believe that effects-based operations was in any way a concept applicable to real war. Quite the opposite. Now, there's always been a desire on the part of soldiers throughout history to kind of come up with certainty. We want some kind of certainty because war rubs that veneer right off you of civilization. It leaves your emotions bare. It's a very uncomfortable situation. Many of us have felt that sinking feeling in our stomach when something goes wrong. But you simply have got to teach people how to deal with uncertainty don't go with a quantification of things when human will, imagination, courage are so important. Those are the ultimate determiners of warfare. So, General Traynor, that's where I was coming from on it, sir. And I'll just stop there and see if you want to ask another question.
We can almost smell the cigar smoke from Mick coming through the computer for those of you that know and have worked with him. Please, go ahead.
David Danello. Sir, I was wondering if you could expand on your comments on Mexico in the Joe.
Wow. Well, the Mexican ambassador's asked to see me, and we hope to link up very soon. I just tell you that the Joe, the Joint Operating Environment, as I described it, is not a statement of U.S. policy. It's not predictive. It's speculative. And it's designed exactly with discussion in mind, to break out of some. How many of you ever heard of the Joint Operating Environment in the last, how about in the last, before this year? A few of you? Good. Because by and large, I found it was not gaining any traction or being acted on, David, at all before. So I brought in some real smart folks. They didn't all wear uniforms, and their job was to come up with a catalyst document to go after the future in a way that was not as constrained to what we would be comfortable with. It's also a way to engage our own nation in what it's doing. For example, where are 95% of the weapons contributing to the murder in Mexico? They're coming from this country right here. Where is all the money coming from that's destabilizing Mexico? It's coming here because of an insatiable drug appetite. I don't even see any drug messages on TV anymore. Remember those old things that showed those frying eggs, your brain on drugs? Haven't seen any. Maybe we can at least start reducing the demand for drugs in this country, recognizing what it's going to do to a neighbor. Maybe we can reduce the number of guns we're sending south because we're coming out saying we've got a problem in Mexico. But it's obviously a very serious concern, their national security situation, and for obvious reasons, it's going to bleed right across the border. So thanks for your book, by the way.
Sir, good to see you. First, I want to congratulate the Marine Corps for the effects-based operation that they successfully conducted in El Anbar province. And I was wondering how you were able to predict in 2004 the effect that you would create in El Anbar province equated to a military operation. But we'll put that aside for another time.
I will answer that, Charlie. Let me explain something to you. It was a non-quantifiable problem, and it was based on military judgment. We quantified what we could, then we implemented our military judgment and inserted that. But the idea that only the Americans could spend hundreds of millions of dollars and say, you know what, I'll bet it's a good idea to have some result in mind if we're going to do something. I mean, Eisenhower landed in Normandy, said, I think I'll just land over there on the beach. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do when I get there. No, he knew he was going to go to Berlin and kill Mr. Hitler. It was very clear what he was going to do. The idea, only the Americans could come up with something that strikingly obvious, declare it a concept, and then make it a rigidly information-laden demander of huge headquarters that would paralyze everything down below. It was a bastardization of what your service did that I resent intellectually about it. It is not where you took it. I think it went too far and had to become rigid and information-laden, because if you did not do that, you could not make the predictive assessments that required quantification. And that's where it went wrong. It was not with what you all did in the beginning. But please go ahead, Charlie, with your question.
But actually, I think your explanation here today of what you really mean is very, very helpful, sir, because I think that there's a lot more common ground with what you said here today than is popularly understood by the bumper stickers.
Yeah.
But what I really want to ask you about is, are you all giving any thought? General Wickham wrote an article about small footprint coin operations, and as we look to the future, is Joint Forces Command giving any thought about how do we adapt an operation where we know we're going to have limited numbers of troops, we can't meet the troop ratio in FM 3-24? How do we go about doing coin operations under those circumstances? You given any thought to that?
I do, Charlie. Thank you. I just got back last week from one of a series of meetings with the Commander of Special Operations Command as we try to marry the General Purpose Forces and SOCOM for how we're going to do this, probably trying to preclude having to send in large, heavy footprints. Obviously, sea basing has a lot to say for it because you don't put those troops ashore other than in temporary locations. An expeditionary situation where not every troop has a big screen TV and 18 entrees on the menu that night as it's completely isolated from the local people. In other words, we're talking about a fundamental shift in comfort levels, basing, and that sort of thing. But also, I think that I would like, if I could make one change to Joint Force Command, kind of superficial right now, I'd change it from Joint Forces Command to Coalition and Joint Forces Command. We're not going to fight alone. And I think if we go into this fight with the understanding that every nation brings something with it, it doesn't matter if we have technical interoperability, if you have a spirit of collaboration and you're willing to work with them, small teams of Americans, whether it be the USS Mercy or Special Forces operating somewhere, or an Air Force team that teaches people how to use small propeller-driven airplanes to maintain surveillance over bad borders and this sort of thing. There's ways we can do this that hopefully will preclude large footprints ashore. But there comes a time, due to this accident of history that we were born into, where the Americans are going to be seen as the leader. And if we are not willing to commit a large number of troops on the ground in some circumstances, we will not prevail. So it's going to be a balancing act, but we see ourselves having to reduce this heavy footprint, this logistically demanding and sometimes problem-causing by its very presence footprint. And we are going in that direction. It's going to require more troops in the Army, the Marines, Navy, Air Force to be advisors, that sort of thing. But we are going in that direction. And if you want to come down and look at what we're doing and give me any of your thoughts, you're welcome. I'd appreciate the outside review.
Thank you, sir.
We've just set up, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, our first joint irregular warfare center. I've brought in a Special Forces officer to run it, and my deputy is now a Navy, he went from 1-star to 3-star, never wore 2, a Navy SEAL who's now the deputy as we try to shift the General Purpose Forces more into a soft approach to fighting without giving up conventional warfare. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. We'll do, if you could we'll do yours and then a quick one from online, and then we'll probably have to wrap up. Okay. So go ahead.
Sir, you had cited both the Romans and the British in India as examples of militaries that were effective at both conventional and irregular warfare. Both of those militaries made very effective use of auxiliaries or indigenous forces. I was wondering if you could comment on our current and future capabilities for training and advising indigenous forces and what Joint Forces Command's role in developing that capability might be.
Sure. General Casey, the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Conway, Admiral Olson and I sat down to try to come up with some idea of what's the division of labor, because this is a growth industry for obvious reasons. We see ourselves doing more of it, as I mentioned just a moment ago, and the division of labor will probably be where we need people to build relationships. That's going to be a special forces kind of job, and they've been expanded. Where we want to just go in and train people in marching, basic marksmanship, first aid, small unit tactics, that sort of thing, the general purpose forces will probably pick up most of those. And that's why we're going to need more troops who are culturally adept, who are comfortable working outside Mother Army, Mother Marine Corps kind of stuff, and able to work in small teams. But this requirement for small teams that can operate in combat or as advisors is now a national priority. We are going to have to create high-performing small units, and we've got some cognitive efforts going on. We also are going to use a lot more simulation. We're going to try to mimic for our joint small units, for our joint forces small units, what the aviation and maritime forces have done with simulation over many, many years. That's part of this shift to an irregular warfare advisor kind of ability without giving up an aggregated conventional force at the same time. There's ways I think that technology can help us, and it especially comes to the human interface. That's where it's really helpful to us. But I think we're on the same sheet of music here.
And finally, Alan.
We have a question from Jason Sherman, a reporter for InsideDefense.com, watching from Brooklyn, New York. 2 questions. As the Pentagon girds itself for a round of fiscal belt-tightening, what capabilities do you believe the military services should shed, and what capabilities do you believe need to be bolstered? And do you believe COCOM should have greater say in development of the Pentagon's budget request?
I'll take the second one first. I really believe that nobody wakes up in the morning saying, I think I'm going to screw the country up today. So if we can go in, I gave that thinking up a long time ago, you know. So I think if we can go in with an intellectually sound argument for what kind of military do we need and make a compelling case for it, we can make the change. For those who are very impatient with the U.S. military, you go back through history, how many militaries in 10 years went from a Bosnia-type constabulary situation to an Afghanistan special forces-led general purpose forces exploitation, integration of air fires. First time I ever left artillery behind in 25 years of fighting was when I went in 350 miles because I trusted the aviation would be there. I worked under a guy I'm proud to say forever I worked under named General Mosley for air support. But as you look at this sort of thing, you can come up with compelling reasons for how you want to organize the U.S. military. The signposts aren't perfect. They're a little dim at times, but you can figure out how to do it. So if you come up with a good reason for what you want to do, I'm convinced you can get the services to go along. Now, as far as the what should we bolster and what should we reduce, you've got to be very careful on reduction and just wiping out a capability. The British, coming out of the Boer War, I believe, thought there would be no more state-on-state warfare. They decided it would be small insurgencies, and 10 years later, 12 years later, their boys are going into machine guns because they can't conceptualize these changes in war, and they just keep throwing boys against it. But I think that when we look at the capabilities we need to retain, we need to retain air superiority, clearly. I think we must retain forcible entry if we want to reassure our friends and threaten our enemies. And we do have enemies in this world. I think that when you look at basing of our troops, I think that is a place that you could tighten the belt in a number of ways. It doesn't mean to bring the troops home. I think we've brought, frankly, too many troops home from Europe. I don't think we should bring home any more troops from Europe. But I think that what you need to look at are what capabilities you want to retain in the conventional, irregular, and nuclear types of war, and make certain that what you do is you confound the enemy's logic. Figure out what they're going to do to move against you, and then checkmate it intellectually. And if you organize the force right, if you maintain sea basing, if you maintain air superiority, if you maintain expeditionary capability, then we're in a position, I think, to more chart our future and not have to respond to the enemy in the future for us. There will be surprises. But like I said, you know, the U.S. military from Bosnia to Afghanistan, keep right on going. Iraq, OIF-1, conventional fight pretty much. OIF-2 was not a conventional fight. What we're going into here with the Taliban, you know, the amount of efforts we've had for humanitarian ops, the U.S. military has proven to be remarkably agile. It's never fast enough for the impatient young folks or those those folks who are refugees from accountability and just sit on the sidelines writing nasty stories, something like that. And I'm not pointing the finger at anybody here, but my point is,
Pointing the finger at everybody here.
but we are pretty darned agile, and we're agile because we come from one great country that espouses the freedom of thought, the free competition of ideas. Troy Dunlap and I have gone back and forth now a couple of times, my friend, and we will continue to do so. We will still drink beer together, and we'll still fight together as we defend this great big experiment we call America. So thanks for having me here, and I hope to get in some more arguments with you here soon, and I look forward to it. Thank you.